The court of 18th century Imperial Russia was a place of etiquette and excess, stunning balls and carnivals, jesters and fireworks. The most popular dance was the quadrille, in which the dancers constantly changed their partners. Around these courtiers spun a huge Russian empire, its rulers coming and going like partners in the dance. This was Russia's age of palace revolutions. The year 1727, 2 years after the death of Peter the Great. Peter had forged an empire through iron will and firm rule. Without him, it seemed to have lost its purpose. State revenue was collapsing. Ships stood unfinished in the shipyards. The army lacked vital equipment. Government bureaucracy was riddled with corruption. Supreme Privy Council ruled the state. It consisted of a handful of nobles who chiefly looked after their own interests. And on the throne, a 12-year-old boy. Chapter 1. Peter II Alexeyevich. Peter II was the son of Prince Alexei and the German Princess Sophie Charlotte of Brunswick-Lüneburg, making him the grandson of Peter the Great. His mother died soon after childbirth, his father when he was just 2. His older sister Natalia was his only close family. Peter seemed unlikely to inherit the throne, as Peter the Great had 2 other sons, Peter and Paul. But they both died in infancy, making Peter the last male of the Romanov dynastic line. Peter was born into an environment devoid of love or affection. His parents cared little for each other, while his father lived in terror of his grandfather, Peter the Great. Indifferent nursemaids gave him wine to stop him crying. His tutors were not much better. He was taught some German and Latin, but that was the extent of his learning. Even his Russian was bad. Nevertheless, by the age of 7, he was well acquainted with the lavish entertainments of court. Young Peter wasn't interested in the army, the navy, or science, only in having fun. It didn't worry those around him. On the contrary, it served their interests. They wanted a Tsar they could control, a Tsar who was in their pocket. It was only a question of whose pocket he ended up in. When Peter II became emperor in 1727, he was immediately taken under the wing of His Serene Highness Alexander Danilovich Menshikov. He'd been a close friend and associate of Peter the Great and his widow, Empress Catherine I, and was the most influential man in Russia. Shortly before Catherine's death, Menshikov had persuaded the Empress to sign a will that made young Peter her heir. There was one condition. On coming of age, Peter was to marry Menshikov's daughter, Maria. Then Menshikov's control of the young Tsar would be total. Of course, no one asked for Peter's opinion on any of this. Soon after his coronation, the 12-year-old Peter found himself engaged to the 16-year-old Maria Menshikova. The Emperor's bride received the title Imperial Highness and an annual allowance of 34,000 rubles. Peter II found his fiancée deeply uninteresting. In his letters, he referred to her as the stone statue or the porcelain doll. Meanwhile, Menshikov moved the young Tsar into his own St. Petersburg palace to shield him from any unwanted external influence, and assigned him a governor, Baron Andrei Ivanovich Osterman, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. But the emperor's studies didn't last long. Menshikov suddenly fell seriously ill, and in his absence, Peter fell in with a young rake, Ivan Dolgorukov, who encouraged him to flee Menshikov's stifling supervision. The Tsar quickly fell under the influence of Dolgorukov and his powerful family, who were bitter rivals of Menshikov. With their encouragement, he and his governor, Baron Osterman, moved out of Menshikov's palace and into the Peterhof Palace. He also broke off his engagement to Maria Menshikova. Soon, a special commission found Menshikov guilty of embezzling state funds. He was stripped of all his titles, honors, estates, and property, and sent, with his family, into internal exile in Siberia. The Dolgorukovs, with the wily Baron Osterman, now held the reins of power. The sovereign, Tsar Peter, was free to indulge in his new favorite sport, hunting. Unlike his great-grandfather, Alexei I, who loved falconry, Peter II hunted without any expertise or knowledge. It didn't matter to him how or what he hunted. What mattered was riding fast and making a lot of noise. All this would have been entirely natural for his age, if it hadn't been for his constant drinking sprees. Nobody cared about his health except his sister Natalia. She was the only person who truly loved the boy emperor and tried to stop him drinking. But, aged just 14, she died of tuberculosis. With no one to stop him, Peter began regularly binge drinking with his guards. He was tall and well developed for his age, and women were also made available to him. Peter then fell in love with his aunt, Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great. Nobody was going to let Peter marry Elizabeth. First of all, the church prohibited marriages between such close relatives. Second, Ivan Dolgorukov had already chosen a bride for him, his sister Catherine. To sway the emperor's decision, Ivan provided proof that his aunt Elizabeth was already in love with an officer of the guards. The hot-headed teenager felt that Elizabeth had betrayed him and made a point of turning his attention to Catherine Dolgorukova. Once more, the Tsar found himself the pawn in other people's games. While the court was absorbed in imperial love matches, the vast Russian Empire was left virtually leaderless. State finances were in chaos. The army was disintegrating. Russia's international standing was in freefall. European ambassadors reported on the situation in Russia. It makes no sense to make an alliance at this time. The Tsar thinks only about his own amusement. His officials think only of how to ruin each other. Everybody lives without a care. It's unclear how such a vast state can maintain itself without any support. Russia's huge bureaucracy had been left to fend for itself, because the body that was supposed to wield power in Russia had effectively ceased to function. The Supreme Privy Council had been established by Catherine I to help her rule the empire, or to be more exact, to rule it for her. Officially, it was only supposed to advise the monarch, but in reality, it was now governing Russia. During Peter II's reign, 6 nobles sat on the Supreme Council: Count Gavrila Golovkin, the Golitsins, Prince Dmitry and Prince Mikhail, the Dolgorukovs, Prince Vasily Vladimirovich and Vasily Lukich, and Baron Osterman. Peter, now 14 years old, had no idea about the problems his country faced, and the Dolgorukovs did everything to keep it that way. The father, Prince Alexei, using his son Ivan to keep Peter distracted. They intended to make the emperor their puppet and turn the clock back by undoing all Peter the Great's modernizing reforms. Peter had already agreed to stop new naval construction, persuaded it was a waste of money, and moved the capital from St. Petersburg back to Moscow, where the hunting was far superior. Only a few steps remained. In November 1728, the emperor's engagement to Ivan's sister, Princess Catherine Dolgorukova, was announced. As Catherine arrived at the palace for the official engagement, her carriage caught under a low gate. In front of guards and onlookers, the gilded crown on the carriage roof was torn off and fell into the gutter. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, the Dolgorukov princes kept the emperor constantly entertained, lest he have time to reconsider his decision. On January 6th, 13 days before the wedding, Peter went to the traditional blessing of the Moscow River. At the ceremony, he played the part of the chivalrous knight, standing on the footboard of Princess Catherine's carriage for hours in freezing weather. The next day, he had a burning fever. Then he was diagnosed with smallpox. Smallpox, also known by its Latin name variola vera, had been present in Europe at a low level for 1,000 years. But in the 18th century, higher population levels and the greater movement of people across the continent caused it to spread like wildfire. Smallpox victims developed spots on their face and limbs, and the rich, both men and women, wore heavy makeup to mask the scars they left. But it was more than just a cosmetic issue. Smallpox was a killer. In Europe, the virus infected more than half the population, about 80 million people, killing 1 in 6. The emperor's health had been ruined by a dissolute lifestyle. His fever and weakened immune system allowed the smallpox to progress quickly. In just 1 week, it was clear Peter would not survive. The Dolgorukovs were in despair. It looked as if all their efforts had been in vain, their grand schemes come to nothing. As the emperor lay dying, the Lefortov palace stood empty and silent, decorated for a wedding that would never take place. His Dolgorukov friends, meanwhile, were desperately looking for a way to cling to power. They decided to make the emperor sign a will, naming his betrothed, the Grand Duchess Catherine Dolgorukova, as his successor. If they had succeeded, the ruling House of Russia would have passed from the House of Romanov to the House of Dolgorukov. But the emperor was not able to sign the will. On January the 18th, 1730, the eve of his planned wedding, he suddenly sat up and ordered his sledge to be harnessed. "I want to go and see my sister," he said. They were his last words. He died the next day. The Supreme Privy Council reacted with indignation to the idea of handing the throne to the Dolgorukovs. The Romanovs were the ruling dynasty of Russia. If the male line was broken, they would turn to the female line. The female line of the Romanovs lived on through the 2 daughters of Peter the Great, Anna and Elizabeth. There were also 3 daughters of Ivan V, Peter's half-brother and joint ruler, who died young. They were Catherine, Anna, and Praskovia. Anna had married the Duke of Holstein. In 1728, she bore him a son, Karl Peter Ulrich. but she died soon after childbirth. Catherine had married the Duke of Mecklenburg and had a 12-year-old daughter, Elizabeth Katerina Christina. Anna was the widow of the Duke of Courland and had no children. Praskovia was married to General Dmitriev Mamonov. The council discussed the suitability of the candidates long into the night. Finally, at 6 a.m., they chose Anna, Duchess of Courland and daughter of Ivan V. Widowed at the age of 17, she lived in Jelgava, near Riga. She had no money and no allies in Moscow. Blessed with neither great charm nor intellect, the council believed they could soon bend her to their will. To avoid any surprises, the council prepared a list of conditions which Anna would have to sign before she took the throne. According to these conditions, the Empress would not have the right to declare war, make treaties, introduce new taxes, or spend state revenue, make promotions above the rank of colonel, give out land, sentence nobles to death, get married, or appoint her successor. All these powers would reside in the Supreme Privy Council. The Empress would have control only over her own income and her palace guards. On the morning of January 19, 1730, the death of Peter II was announced publicly. At the same time, a delegation set off from Moscow to see Anna. 9 days later, she signed the conditions. Russian autocracy had been abolished. In its place, oligarchy, the rule of an elite few. Anna arrived in Moscow, where she was greeted by her guards, the Preobrazhensky Regiment. Anna declared that she was to be their chief and spoke privately with the officers. She learned many interesting things from these conversations. She was told the people of Moscow were outraged by the conditions that had been imposed upon her, and that the Privy Council was despised by many of the nobles. Just days ago, Anna had been an impoverished, forgotten duchess in out-of-the-way Courland. Now she was within a stone's throw of becoming Empress of Russia. She sensed her moment. She gathered her guards and senior nobles in the palace hall and showed them what she thought of the conditions. Chapter 2. Anna Ivanovna. Within a week, the Supreme Privy Council was dismissed. Within a month, Prince Alexei Dolgorukov and his son Ivan were exiled to the Siberian town of Berezov, where their sworn enemy Menshikov had died the year before. The day after becoming Empress, Anna demanded to see all the items confiscated from the famously wealthy Menshikov. She picked out jewelry for herself worth 23,000 rubles, 138 million today, about $4 million US. She appointed a Russian architect of Italian parentage, Bartolomeo Rastrelli, to build 2 new palaces for her, a wooden winter palace in the Kremlin and a stone summer palace on the Yauza River, to help her settle in. Anna's German chamberlain, Ernst Biron, followed his mistress to Moscow. He was Anna's favorite and her lover. The fact that he was married with 3 children didn't concern her. Anna herself was the secret mother of his youngest son, Karl Ernst, which is why the boy was brought to Moscow. Later, they were joined by Biron's wife and elder sons. Together, they formed Russia's unorthodox new imperial family. The typical day for Empress Anna began at 8 a.m. when she took her coffee. She worked between 9 and 10, receiving ministers and signing decrees. Then she went riding with Biron. And at noon she had lunch with him, his wife and children. Then she went to bed for an hour. The rest of the day was solely for her own amusement. Anna found many unusual ways to entertain herself. One of her favorite was shooting crows. This was why a loaded musket was left by each of the palace windows. The Empress didn't just shoot birds, she also hunted bears with a spear. But there were also more sophisticated entertainments at court, Italian operas and theatre. In Anna's reign, the first Russian dance school was founded. But nothing delighted the Empress quite as much as watching her court jesters and dwarves fighting. Jesters first appeared in Russia in the reign of Ivan the Terrible. A century later, Alexei I liked to play chess against his own jester, an acrimonious hunchback named Balthazar. Peter the Great's jesters included a former officer of the Preobrazhensky regiment, Ivan Balakrev, who advised the Tsar on serious issues, and a Jew who'd converted to Christianity, Jan da Costa, who debated theology with the Tsar. The position of court jester flourished during the reign of Empress Anna. Now there were more than ever. Balakrev and da Costa were joined by the Italian musician Pietro Pedrillo, and noblemen who'd been demoted to jesters, Prince Nikita Volkonsky, Prince Mikhail Galitsyn, and Count Alexei Apraksin. Her troupe of entertainers also featured 10 dwarves, 1 Kalmuk woman, and 2 Evenk women from Russia's easternmost regions. The Empress acquired a taste for exotic and spectacular parties, lavish banquets, masquerades and fireworks. The only thing she frowned on was drinking. Alcohol had caused the early death of her young husband, the Duke of Courland, after he had tried to keep pace with Peter the Great's drinking at their own wedding celebration. The Empress created a ministerial cabinet to handle the business of government. It was the Supreme Privy Council in all but name, just with new faces. Only the wily Baron Osterman kept his place, becoming the elder statesman of Anna's government. The Empress herself barely followed affairs of state. But Biron, who now held the title Duke of Courland, took an active role in cabinet business. One cabinet minister, Artemy Volinsky, wrote, "The Empress is a fool. It's impossible to get any decision from her. Duke Biron does as he pleases." For opposing Biron, Volinsky was charged with treason and executed. The very thought of a palace revolution terrified Anna. She had Peter the Great's daughter Elizabeth watched to look for any hint of conspiracy. And she re-established the secret Chancellery of Investigations, founded by Peter but abolished by his successor. Its role was to sniff out any trace of political dissent. Its agents were everywhere and were rightly feared. Any careless word, particularly about the Empress, could lead to arrest and inevitably torture. In the course of Anna's 10-year reign, the secret Chancellery arrested and tortured about 28,000 suspects. Of those, 20,000 were exiled to Siberia and Kamchatka. 5,000 went missing, 2,000 died during torture, and more than 1,000 were executed. The Empress was suspicious of her guards too, especially the Preobrazhensky regiment. They'd put her on the throne. They could depose her too. So she created a second guards regiment, Izmailovsky. The new regiment's officers were recruited from her native Duchy of Courland and took over guard duty at the palace. The Preobrazhensky regiment was sent to fight the Turks. At Belgrade in 1739, a treaty was signed to end the 4-year conflict between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. Under its terms, Azov and parts of Ukraine became part of Russia. But Russian warships and merchant ships were forbidden from sailing in the Sea of Azov or the Black Sea. The war cost the Russian army about 46,000 men. Only about 6,000, or 1 in 8 of those men, fell in battle. The remaining 40,000 died from disease, starvation, and neglect. Anna didn't concern herself with these details. She was glad the war was over, but her main concern was moving the court from Moscow back to St. Petersburg. In 1737, Moscow had been devastated by a great fire. The Kremlin, Kitay-Gorod, the surrounding White Town, part of the Earth Town, almost all the modern city center, was burnt to the ground. At the time, the great Tsar bell had been standing in the Kremlin foundry. The scaffolding around it caught fire. When water was poured onto it, the bell burst from the sudden temperature change. Anna's winter palace also burnt down. But 6 months later, the Empress was celebrating her birthday in a new winter palace, built for her by Bartolomeo Rastrelli in St. Petersburg. The state apartments consisted of more than 100 rooms, all of them decorated in the most lavish style. Under Anna's reign, expenditure on the court reached 260,000 rubles per year, worth about $42 million today. The running costs of Duke Biron's stables were 100,000 rubles, about $17 million, while small-scale expenditures by the Empress totaled 42,500 rubles, or $7 million. Incredibly, the Empress spent as much on jewelry as it cost to maintain the Academy of Sciences, about 47,000 rubles, or $8 million. Just a tenth of that sum was spent on public education, a measly 4,500 rubles. Anna's most decadent celebration was held for the wedding of two of her court jesters, in a palace of ice. On Anna's whim, the 53-year-old Mikhail Golitsyn was to marry a 20-year-old Kalmuk girl named Avdotia Buzheninova. The bill for the party came to 30,000 rubles. A house of ice, 17 meters long and 3 meters high, was built between the Admiralty and the Winter Palace. 6 ice cannon and 2 mortars stood by the entrance. By the gates there were ice sculptures of elephants and dolphins, while everything inside the house, even the furniture, was made of ice. Before the wedding, a masked procession passed through the city streets playing horns and balalaikas. It included representatives from across the empire, Ukrainians from the south and Nenets from the far north. The bride and groom traveled in a cage mounted on top of an elephant, and after the wedding were left in the bedroom of the ice palace. The French ambassador, Marquis de la Chetardie, was one of the guests. Only in this country is there such fun to be had. The bride and groom were taken to an ice house. It was kept warm with straw. The light that shone in through the ice from all sides was extraordinary. All who saw it were amazed. One of the few not enjoying themselves was the Empress's beautiful cousin, Princess Elizabeth, now treated with open suspicion. Princess Elizabeth was adored by the guards. She was godmother to their children and lent some of them money. But most importantly, she was Peter the Great's daughter. Her popularity had become a threat to Anna's plans for the succession. Anna wanted the throne to remain with her father's line, that of Ivan V, half-brother and joint ruler with Peter the Great. So Anna announced that her heir would be the future son of her 14-year-old niece, Elizabeth Katerina Christina, even though at the time she wasn't even married. Elizabeth took the name Anna Leopoldovna after converting to Orthodoxy, and at 20 married the Duke of Brunswick, Anton Ulrich, summoned to Russia for that purpose. Soon the couple had a son, Ion Antonovich. When the new heir to the Russian throne was just 2 months old, Empress Anna fell seriously ill with kidney stones. Inflammation and infection set in. Just 2 weeks after the first symptoms, on October 17, 1740, Anna died. One of her last acts was to sign a decree appointing a regent for the infant emperor, the Duke of Courland, Ernst Biron. The Russian people felt no great loss at the death of Empress Anna. Her reign would be remembered for excess, frivolity, and cruelty. Nevertheless, it was Anna who pushed forward the development of St. Petersburg. Many of its grandest and most famous buildings, including the Peter and Paul Cathedral, the Admiralty with its high spire, and the fountains of the Peterhof Palace, were completed in the 1730s, under the supervision of the Italian architects Rastrelli and Trazzini. Italian musical theatre made its first appearance in Russia, while the Academy of Sciences published a regular newspaper, the St. Petersburg News, as well as the first Russian scientific journals. Elsewhere, the foundations of Russian literature were being laid by poets such as Trediakovsky and the young Lomonosov. The Empress herself, of course, was interested only in much cruder forms of entertainment. She had neither the intellect, energy, nor charisma to be an effective ruler, a position that, after all, came to her almost by chance. And within 2 weeks of her death, all the plans she had laid for her succession had collapsed like a house of cards. No one was satisfied by the appointment of Anna's lover, Ernst Biron, as regent to the infant emperor Ivan VI. And so the Guards intervened again. On the night of November 9, 1740, Field Marshal Count von Munich and 80 guardsmen burst into the Winter Palace. He sealed the exits and sent his adjutant to find Biron. According to the adjutant's report, Biron was sleeping soundly when they arrived. When he was awoken, he tried to hide under the bed, but the soldiers dragged him out. He struck out in an effort to break free, but the soldiers answered his blows with musket butts. He was then stripped naked, tied up, and carried to the guardhouse, where he was loaded into the field marshal's waiting carriage. He was carried out past the very rooms in which Anna's coffin was still lying. By 6 a.m., the palace coup was over. Russia had a new regent, the infant emperor's mother, the 21-year-old Anna Leopoldovna, rumored to be even less intelligent than her aunt, the late empress. Anna was madly in love with a Saxon diplomat named Count Linar. Russian nobles feared they had another Biron on their hands when Linar was given the post of Grand Chamberlain. He then briefly returned to Saxony to settle his affairs at home. But before he could return, the Russian throne changed hands once more. Peter the Great's daughter, Elizabeth, had finally made her move. Many people knew about the plot to put Elizabeth on the throne. Courtiers warned Anna about it every day. She paid little attention, until finally she decided to speak with Elizabeth herself. Elizabeth was her half-cousin once removed, and 10 years her senior. Meeting warned Elizabeth that she was suspected. She had to act fast. She summoned a few trusted men, donned a gilded breastplate over her parade uniform, and went to the barracks of the Preobrazhensky regiment. "Do you remember whose daughter I am?" she cried. "Are you ready to die for me?" The guards responded with loud cheers. Elizabeth led them to the Winter Palace, where the guards also quickly switched their allegiance. She entered the bedroom of Anna Leopoldovna with the words, "Sister, it's time to get up." Then she went to the nursery of the infant Emperor Ivan. she ordered her men not to wake him. She took Ivan in her arms, kissed him, and said, "You're not to blame, little one." Nobody knew what to do with him. Elizabeth left the Winter Palace with the child in her arms. Chapter 3. Elizabeth Petrovna. The little Ivan VI became Russia's man in the Iron Mask. Almost all his short, tragic life was spent in closely guarded confinement. First in Ranenburg, then in Kalmogori, and then in solitary confinement in the Schlisselburg fortress, where he was held as a prisoner with no name. Ivan spent 7 years in a cell with no natural light, with only the Bible to read. At the age of 24, he was murdered by his guards during a failed rescue attempt. His parents spent the rest of their lives under guard in Kolmogori, far to the north, so that no one was ever tempted to restore their family to the throne. In the aftermath of the Palace Revolution, Ivan VI's fate was not yet known. Elizabeth had many important decisions to make. First, she announced that she would restore the laws and state bodies established by her father, Peter the Great. The Senate resumed its work as a legislative and judicial body. The ministerial cabinet was dismissed. Elizabeth would learn to keep a close eye on all her advisors, to ensure none grew too powerful or dared challenge her authority. During her magnificent coronation, Elizabeth became the first Russian monarch to place the crown upon her own head, a moment rich in symbolism. Foreigners who'd helped Elizabeth gain power, hoping for special treatment, were disappointed. The new empress wasn't going to dance to anyone else's tune. On one occasion, her agents intercepted a letter sent by her old friend, the French ambassador Marquis de Chetardy. The smallest matters terrify her. Weakness and instability. This is the essence of all the Tsaritsa's actions. Marquis was sent home within 24 hours. The Empress never forgot who'd really put her in power. The Guards. Now she entrusted her life to them, creating a special unit to act as her bodyguard. The Leap Company was an elite unit made up of the 300 grenadiers and 64 officers that had put Elizabeth on the throne. These men could do virtually whatever they liked, and made for terrible guards, often drinking on duty, falling asleep, and even leaving their posts. But the Empress excused them anything. She herself was the unit's commanding officer. Its officers were her friends and closest allies, including the brothers Peter and Alexander Shuvalov and her lover, Alexei Razumovsky. Alexei Razumovsky held no political rank at all, but if he'd wanted, he could have become the most influential man in Russia. Wielding power did not interest him. He was good-natured and entirely without ambition. The Empress's happiness was his only concern. The son of a Cossack farmer from northern Ukraine, he had a fine singing voice and was extremely handsome. He became Elizabeth's constant companion. He was cheerful, calm, and dependable, and they were devoted to each other. Razumovsky gave Elizabeth a taste for Ukrainian cuisine, and her cooks prepared borscht with garlic and dumplings for her almost every day. The Empress liked to eat well and had certain peculiar habits. For example, she always had a radish with a glass of vodka, ate something fatty late at night, and drank a lot of coffee. Her personal coffee maker, Karl Sievers, was obliged to follow her everywhere to make coffee for her. The Empress adored sweet things too. Confectioners were hired from France and Italy to create fantastic sculptures from sugar and sponge. Like her mother, Catherine I, Elizabeth was a night owl and stayed up long after the balls had finished. And there was always the lingering fear of a nighttime palace coup. Elizabeth never slept in the same room twice, and her apartments were constantly being altered. New doors and windows were cut through the walls, staircases were moved, all measures to create new escape routes and to confuse any potential conspirators. This deep fear was masked by a busy schedule of court entertainments. On Mondays, music for dancing. On Wednesdays, Italian music. On Tuesdays and Fridays, theatre. Elizabeth loved balls and masquerades and could happily dance through the night. She liked to devise her own magical or comical themes. For instance, making all the men come dressed as women and the women as men. All the guests would be made to look ridiculous, except Elizabeth herself, whose shapely legs were universally admired. The Empress was a great beauty, but hugely vain. Her courtiers were expected to pay her endless compliments, while ladies feared to dress too well in case they were thought to be competing with her. To ensure she was always the most magnificently attired, Elizabeth would issue strict rules before a ball, stipulating certain colors or hairstyles that only she was permitted to wear. The Empress's wardrobe was reported to include no fewer than 15,000 dresses. She never wore a dress twice, and sometimes changed several times in a single evening. Merchants importing expensive textiles from abroad were obliged to bring them to the Empress first, so she could select the finest fabrics for herself. The Rococo style was the latest fashion in Europe, which meant frilly shirts for the men and for the women whalebone corsets to create tiny waists and huge skirts supported by cane hoop petticoats. Fantastically elaborate hairdos were all the rage, some of them 60 centimeters high and shaped to resemble fancy hats, flower beds, or even ships and windmills. Small flasks of water holding live flowers were sometimes tied into the hair. At night, it was recommended to cover such constructions with a nightcap to prevent lice from crawling in. Empress Elizabeth also demanded palaces to equal anything in Austria or France. This is where the genius of Bartolomeo Rastrelli came in. The son of a famous Italian sculptor, Rastrelli moved to St. Petersburg as a teenager, and his work soon found favor with the Empress Anna. As senior court architect, he was kept on by Elizabeth, and his projects became yet more daring and grand. His designs included the new Winter Palace, Smolny Cathedral, Grand Peterhof Palace, and the Zaskiasello Palace. The cost was astronomical. The palace at Zaskiasello alone cost 1.6 million rubles, the equivalent of about $270 million today. This at a time when the Russian economy was crippled by corruption and a currency crisis. Russians, uncertain of the future, had begun to hoard more and more currency. Every year the state increased coin production, but they simply vanished into the economy. There were approximately 54 million coins in circulation, but none of them were circulating. Many industries, such as the extremely lucrative salt trade, were state-sanctioned monopolies run by influential officials and friends of the Empress, like Peter Shuvalov. Corruption had reached extraordinary levels. Almost all of Elizabeth's ministers also received wages from foreign countries. Those taking payments from foreign governments included the Chancellor, Alexei Bestujev-Ryumin, and the Vice-Chancellor, Mikhail Vorontsov. It was once said of Vorontsov that he was on sale to the first bidder. The Empress needed foreign money too. Word spread that she was willing to sign conventions for subsidies. In these unequal agreements, Russia agreed to enter a war on one side or another in exchange for cash payments. Russia had become, in effect, a state for hire. One thing Elizabeth refused to sign was any death warrant. When she came to power, she'd sworn that she'd have no one executed, and was true to her word. An entire generation of noblemen grew up without fear of the scaffold. Slowly but surely, the Russian economy began to modernize. The first banks opened, offering loans at 6% per annum. Industry was expanding rapidly. Russia was producing 2 million poods, or 33,000 tons, of cast iron a year, half of which was sold overseas. The Russian population was rising, 5 million in a quarter of a century. As she aged, Elizabeth became increasingly worried about losing her looks. She sought reassurance in the arms of a court page, 18 years her junior, named Ivan Shuvalov. Her infatuation with this handsome youth soon turned to love. Her former favorite, Razumovsky, quickly understood. Without scandal or acrimony, he quietly withdrew from court. The new favorite was much like the old, calm, gentle, and good-natured, and absolutely loyal to the Empress. He asked for neither money nor positions. However, unlike Razumovsky, Shuvalov was highly educated. He corresponded with the French philosopher Helvetius and was passionate about improving the state of Russian education. Thanks to his influence, Elizabeth authorized the founding of the Russian Academy of Arts and Moscow University. But the life of the Merry Empress was not all balls and parties. She had another passion: foreign policy. In the 1740s, the warlike King Frederick of Prussia was seeking to expand his realm at the expense of his neighbors, and to establish Prussia as a great power. Most of the other European powers were determined to stop him, and formed themselves into an alliance. The driving forces behind the alliance were Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria, Elizabeth, Empress of Russia, and Madame Pompadour, mistress of the King of France. Frederick, famous for his low opinion of women, was nevertheless an intellectual and a wit, who nicknamed the alliance against him the League of the Three Petticoats. The three women had led their countries into one of the greatest conflicts in European history, the 7 Years' War. Russia joined the fray in 1757, launching an attack on East Prussia. After meeting the Russian army in battle, Frederick declared, "To stop a Russian soldier, you need 2 bullets. One to kill him, another to bring him down." Following a decisive victory against the Prussian army at Kunersdorf, Russian forces took control of eastern Prussia. The following year, 1760, Russian troops briefly occupied Frederick's capital, Berlin. The war seemed to be virtually won. But suddenly, inexplicably, military operations were called to a halt. On Christmas Eve, 1761, Elizabeth had a sudden sensation that she was dying. All her life, the word death had terrified her. But now, she was perfectly calm. She made her confession, took communion, and bid farewell to relatives and friends. She gave her last advice to her heir, Peter Fyodorovich, and his wife Catherine: be friends. On Christmas Day, she died. Elizabeth was laid in her coffin wearing a silver dress with lace sleeves, a golden crown on her head, beautiful and serene, as she had been in her youth. But those at the funeral were fixated instead on the strange behavior of the new emperor, Peter III. He either walked too slowly or ran, laughed or grimaced. It was whispered that he'd already ordered Russian troops out of Prussia and offered his idol, King Frederick, peace with no demands. It didn't seem to matter to him that thousands of Russian soldiers would have died in vain. There were soon doubts about the new emperor's sanity and what he might do. One thing seemed certain: the endless parties, the glamour and frivolity of Elizabeth's court were a thing of the past. But some already looked to Peter III's young wife, Catherine, and wondered if that glorious age could not be reclaimed.